So the massive takeaway from the new Netflix thriller Hypnotic is to not answer any phone calls from unknown numbers. A young woman seeking self-improvement enlists the help of a renowned hypnotist, but after a handful of intense sessions, she soon discovers unexpected and deadly consequences. Now, I've been seeing a lot of Kate Siegel lately. There was Midnight Mass, and then I just watched her in Hush. Now she's in the psychological thriller Hypnotic, where she plays a woman dealing with some past trauma that is preventing her from moving forward in her life. So then she decides to see a therapist who recommends hypnotherapy. From there, the story isn't very shrouded in its mystery, and I'm kind of surprised that the movie didn't try to conceal the plot more than it did. The antagonist is quite obvious, even though the story does try a couple of times to plant some doubt. The themes of power and control are done well here, and they're pretty unnerving. Now, I'm not sure how possible this actually is, but in concept, it's terrifying that someone could gain so much control over another just through hypnosis. And the movie uses this to its advantage, creating some engaging scenarios. And Kate Siegel does a good job at playing the terrified but capable protagonist. She's smart and a thinker who's already a bit skeptical, which I really like. Her search for mental relief is what even draws her to the therapy. So even though the plot is obvious, her character isn't one who just kind of stumbles about and ends up being involved in weirdness by happenstance. Now, this is kind of like a Hallmark movie with just a touch more suspense. It's 89 minutes, and for the most part, it moves along efficiently. But I think that because the plot progression is so obvious, it ends up making the movie feel longer than it actually is. I found myself just wishing that they'd get to the climax, since it was pretty much already determined where everything was headed. The music in this is a pounding and racing score that does help to increase tension and anxiety. I mean, not that the scenes were really that intense, but the music worked to make my brain believe that they were. Jason O'Mara plays the therapist, and he exudes just the right amount of creepy swagger. He's not so subtle that we can't see through him, but his arrogance and confidence do lend themselves to a slightly diabolical persona. Dulé Hill is a detective who's working the cases of some other women that have died mysteriously and that may have been tied to O'Mara's therapist. He's okay for what he's in, but most of the time he's kind of sidelined in the story, mainly there almost as a side distraction in the attempt to just add a bit more drama and intrigue. The mystery that he's investigating really does need some work. It didn't pique my interest, and it felt like it was only loosely tied to the main story, even though there's a lot that could intersect. There's some action towards the final act of the movie that does help to make this a little exciting. But then there's a fight scene towards the end of the film that is just really unconvincing. The punches thrown are slow and they're obviously staged, but something that did work during this time is how the camera would slowly spin, like somebody drifting off into their subconscious. There are some twists in this that work really well, and then a couple that unfortunately are just way too obvious. And something that I did really enjoy is the layers that are involved in the actual hypnosis storyline. The movie does play with these at times, which are effective, but once we've seen them, they're no longer surprising, so they lose effectiveness every time they're utilized. I think the biggest weakness of this is that the movie never fully engaged me in the narrative. The acting is all decent, but the characters aren't terribly intriguing. And when someone is meant to be menacing, they're just not. I think the obviousness of this ends up hurting the story in ways that make the entire process uninteresting, despite there being some items here and there that I enjoyed. There's some really good potential in this, especially with the concept of the ability to insert your own will into someone else's subconscious through hypnosis. I mean, think about it. To be able to say words that then trigger someone into acting a certain way or carrying out a certain behavior. I mean, it's sort of like with the Manchurian Candidate. And that's a terrifying prospect, but one that this story never fully embraces, causing the whole thing to sort of just waver in and out of effectiveness. So overall, I was disappointed with Hypnotic. I really like Kate Siegel and think that she did okay for what she has to work with. The story has a lot of potential to be a very unsettling and even a terrifying psychological horror, but because it never fully embraces what it could be, the whole thing falters. The obviousness of the plot and execution also work against any suspense and tension, making me wish that I was the one being hypnotized so I could forget I ever saw this. But again, that's not going to be necessary because it's very forgettable on its own. There's no sex or nudity, some profanity, and a bunch of violence. I give Hypnotic 2 out of 5 couches. Are there any good psychological thrillers that you've seen lately? I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.